Before the time of stories written in books, before the age of iron or even of bronze, the world was a quieter place. The loudest sounds were the cry of the wind across the open land, the rush of a river in the spring thaw, or the distant call of a hunting horn. In the heart of a great rolling island that would one day be called England, there lay a vast and empty expanse of chalky downland, a place known now as the Salisbury Plain. Imagine this plain, if you will, as it was then, 5,000 years ago. It was not a flat and featureless place, but a gentle ocean of land, rising and falling in long, slow waves under a sky that seemed impossibly large. The grass was tough and springy, grazed by herds of wild aurochs, the ancestors of cattle, and shy, fleet-footed deer. In the hollows, ancient yew trees grew, their dark leaves a stark contrast to the pale green of the downs. The air was clean and smelled of damp earth, of crushed wild thyme, and of the sweet scent of clover on a summer's day. For generations, people had lived on the edges of this plain. They were small communities, families and clans, who understood the rhythms of the earth as intimately as they knew the faces of their own children. They were people of the Neolithic, the new Stone Age. Their tools were crafted with breathtaking skill from flint and bone, their clothes were of leather and woven wool, and their homes were simple roundhouses of wood, wattle, and daub, warmed by a central fire whose smoke drifted up through a hole in the thatched roof. They watched the sun, the great golden god who brought warmth and life. They watched the moon, the silver goddess who governed the tides and the secret, silent world of the night. They saw how the sun's position in the sky changed with the passing of the year. They knew that on the shortest day of winter, it would rise at its most southerly point, a pale and hesitant light offering the promise of returning warmth. And they knew that on the longest day of summer, it would rise at its most northerly point, a triumphant blaze of glory, bathing the land in light and life. These were not just observations. They were the sacred pulse of existence, the great turning wheel of the seasons upon which all life depended. And on this vast empty plain, they felt a special kind of presence. Perhaps it was the way the sky met the earth in a perfect, unbroken circle. Perhaps it was the quality of the light at dawn, when the mists in the valleys looked like sleeping white dragons. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a feeling in the very soil, an ancient memory that whispered to them on the wind. For whatever reason, they chose this place. They chose it not for a village or a farm, but for something far grander, something that would speak not just to their own small community, but to the sun and the moon themselves. They decided to build a temple to time. The first act was not one of building, but of shaping. They came together, hundreds of them, from settlements scattered across the downs. They brought with them their simple yet effective tools. They used picks fashioned from the shed antlers of the great red deer, the tines hardened and sharpened by fire. They used shovels made from the broad, strong shoulder blades of oxen. With these humble instruments, they began to break the skin of the earth. The work was slow, a rhythmic and patient labor. The sound of antler on chalk was a dull, percussive thump, 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 a sound that would echo across the plain for months, for years. They dug a great circular ditch, not a perfect circle, but one with the subtle, organic feel of something made by human hands. It was wide and deep, a significant boundary between the ordinary world outside and the sacred space they were creating within. The chalk they dug out, brilliantly white against the green turf, was piled up on the inner side of the ditch, forming a high, circular bank. Imagine them at their work. The sun warms their backs as they stoop and dig. The wind tangles their long hair. They work together, a community united in a single, silent purpose. There is no foreman shouting orders, no master plan drawn on parchment. The knowledge is shared, passed down through generations, an instinct for form and function, for sacred geometry that existed in their hearts and minds. They would pause to drink water from clay beakers, to eat bread baked on hot stones, and to look at their progress, at the white ring growing ever larger upon the green land. As they dug this great circle, this henge, they did something else, something mysterious and profound. Just inside the chalk bank, they dug a ring of 56 pits. They are known to us now as the Aubrey Holes, named for the man who rediscovered them thousands of years later. But to the people who dug them, they were something more. They were not random holes. They were carefully spaced, a precise ring of shadows in the white earth. What were they for? We cannot know for certain, for they left no written words. But we can imagine. Perhaps each pit once held a tall wooden post, a circle of silent, wooden sentinels pointing to the sky. Or perhaps they were part of a great astronomical calculator, a way of tracking the phases of the moon, or predicting the terrifying, awe-inspiring moments of an eclipse. Maybe they placed special stones in them, or offerings to the spirits of the earth. Some of the holes show signs that they were dug and refilled many times over the centuries, as if they were part of a long and evolving ritual. It is also within these pits, and within the ditch itself, that they began to bury their dead. Not everyone, but certain chosen people. The remains they laid to rest were cremated, the ashes placed carefully in the earth, sometimes with a simple pin of carved bone or a small, polished stone. This was not just a monument, it was becoming a cemetery, a place where the world of the living could meet the world of the ancestors. The spirits of their most revered dead would now guard this sacred circle, their presence forever woven into the fabric of the place. For a long time, perhaps for 500 years, this was the monument, a great white circle of chalk on the green plain, visible from miles around. Inside, perhaps, stood the circle of tall wooden poles, stark against the sky. People would come here at special times of the year. They would walk the ceremonial entranceway, a broad avenue flanked by smaller ditches, which led towards the circle. They would gather on the bank and look out across the plain, or into the sacred space within. They would watch the sun rise and set, marking its journey across the sky. They would feel the presence of their ancestors in the ground beneath their feet. It was a place of quiet power, a cathedral of earth and wood, a testament to the first great act of will that transformed this landscape forever. The first secret of Stonehenge was written not in stone, but in the very chalk and soil of the Salisbury Plain. And it slept there, under the sun and the stars, dreaming of the giants that were yet to come. The seasons turned, hundreds of times. Winter snows blanketed the white chalk bank, making it disappear into the landscape. Spring rains filled the ditch with water, creating a shimmering, circular moat. Summer sun baked the earth hard, and autumn winds whispered through the tall grasses. Generations were born, lived their lives, and were laid to rest. The stories of the great digging were told and retold around the hearth fires, becoming legends. The wooden posts within the circle rotted and were replaced again and again. The monument was tended, respected, and used. It was a living part of the world. But a new idea was stirring, a new ambition that was as bold and audacious as the first. The people of the plain were no longer content with a temple of earth and wood. They dreamt of something more permanent, something that would last for an eternity. They dreamt of stone. But not just any stone. Far to the west, across the water, in a rugged, windswept land that would one day be called Wales, there was a special place, the Preseli Hills. These are not tall, jagged mountains, but ancient, rounded hills, often shrouded in mist, their slopes dotted with rocky outcrops and bubbling springs. And here, in these hills, were stones unlike any other. Some were of a hard, dense rock called dolerite, which, when freshly broken, was a deep, dark blue-gray, speckled with flecks of white that glittered like stars in a night sky. When the rain fell upon them, they seemed to turn a deeper, more mysterious shade of blue. These were the bluestones. They were believed to have special properties. Perhaps they were thought to have healing powers. If you struck them, some of them would ring with a clear, musical note, like a bell. They were stones that seemed alive, filled with a secret energy. The decision was made. These sacred stones, these pieces of the magical Welsh hills, must be brought to the great circle on the Salisbury Plain. It was a journey of almost 200 miles. A journey over land, over river, and over sea. A journey that, even with all our modern technology, would be a monumental challenge. For people whose only tools were stone, wood, and rope, it was an act of almost unimaginable faith and effort. First, they had to quarry the stones. This was not done with explosives or great machines. It was a slow, patient conversation with the rock itself. They would find natural fissures and cracks in the outcrops. Into these cracks they would hammer wooden wedges. Then, they would pour water over the wedges, and as the wood swelled with moisture, it would exert a slow, immense pressure, until with a great groan, a pillar of stone would break free from the hillside. Each stone weighed as much as 2 large bulls, some even more. They were rough, natural pillars, raw and powerful. Then came the journey. They would lower the great stones onto wooden sledges, perhaps greasing the runners with animal fat to help them slide. They would drag them down the steep hillsides, using strong ropes of twisted hide and plant fiber, and the combined strength of dozens of people. The air would be filled with chanting, rhythmic calls to coordinate the pulling, to keep the great weight from running out of control. They brought them to the river, the Cledau, which flows down to a great natural harbor. Here, they must have built great rafts. Imagine the scene: colossal logs, lashed together with yet more rope, the great blue pillars carefully loaded and balanced upon them. Then, they would pull and paddle their precious cargo down the river, out into the treacherous waters of the Bristol Channel. They would have hugged the coastline, waiting for calm seas and favorable tides. These were not sailors in the way we might think of them, but they understood the sea, its moods and its dangers. They navigated by the shape of the coast, by the sun and the stars. The journey by sea would have been the most perilous part. A sudden storm, a rogue wave, could have sent a stone, the product of years of effort, plunging into the depths, lost forever. The loss would have been not just of labor, but of something sacred. After the sea journey, they entered the rivers on the other side and began the long, slow haul overland again, up onto the Salisbury Plain. The entire journey for a single stone might have taken many months, even years, and they brought not one, but around 80 of them. It was a pilgrimage of stone, a multi-generational project that bound together communities across hundreds of miles. The people of the Preseli Hills were giving a part of their sacred landscape to the people of the plain, and the people of the plain were accepting it with reverence and immense toil. When the blue stones finally arrived at the Great Circle, it must have been a time of incredible celebration and ceremony. These were not just building materials, they were ancestors, spirits, pieces of a holy mountain. They were the embodiment of an incredible human endeavor. And now, a new phase of work began at the monument. They dug a new series of holes within the original earthwork, this time in a double arc, a crescent shape. With immense effort, using levers, ropes, and earthen ramps, they raised the blue stones from the earth and set them upright in the pits. For the first time, a circle of stone stood on the Salisbury Plain, a double arc of deep blue-gray pillars brought from a distant, mist-shrouded land. They were not perfectly shaped or smooth, but retained their raw, natural power. They must have seemed utterly magical, a concentration of otherworldly energy in the center of their sacred space. At sunrise, their eastern faces would be lit, and at sunset their western faces would glow. In the rain, they would gleam with a deep, dark luster. They had brought the mountains to the plain, and the temple was transformed. It now had a heart of stone, a heart that had traveled over land and sea, a heart that beat with the slow, patient rhythm of a people's unwavering devotion. The circle was no longer just a shape on the land. It was a gathering of silent, powerful beings, listening to the secrets of the earth and sky. The bluestone circle stood for perhaps a century or two, a marvel on the open plain. It was a focal point for ceremony, a place of healing, a monument to a journey that had become a legend. But the vision of the builders was not yet complete. The ambition that had brought the stones from the mountains of Wales was about to be dwarfed by an idea even more immense, more audacious. They were about to summon giants to their circle. About 20 miles to the north of the Great Henge lay another area of downland, the Marlborough Downs. Here, scattered across the landscape like a flock of sleeping sheep, lay enormous boulders of sandstone. They were sarsen stones, remnants of an ancient seabed, compressed and hardened over millions of years, left behind by the retreating ice of the last great ice age. The local people called them gray weathers, for in the misty dawn light they did indeed look like giant slumbering sheep. These were the stones the builders now coveted. They were colossal, many times larger and heavier than the bluestones. The largest of them weighed over 40 tons, the weight of a whole herd of cattle or a small whale. They were a different kind of stone, not magical and mysterious like the bluestones, but solid, enduring, and monumental. They represented permanence, strength, and an unbreakable connection to the very bedrock of the land. The new plan was breathtaking in its scale. They would create an outer circle of these giant sarsen stones, and within it, a horseshoe of 5 even larger structures called trilithons, 2 upright stones with a third, a lintel, laid across the top. This would be the Stonehenge that we recognize today, the iconic silhouette against the sky. The first task was to select the stones. They would have walked the downs, inspecting the gray weathers, looking for boulders of the right size and shape, free from major flaws. Once a stone was chosen, the real work began. They did not just transport these stones, they shaped them. This was a revolutionary step. Using heavy, rounded hammerstones called mauls, they began to pound and chip away at the sarsens. It was a process of almost infinite patience. The sound would have filled the downs, a constant, rhythmic clink, clink, clink of stone on stone, hour after hour, day after day. They were not just making them into rough rectangular blocks. They were crafting them with incredible sophistication. The upright stones were subtly tapered towards the top, an architectural trick to make them look straighter and taller when viewed from the ground. The inner faces were made smoother than the outer faces, and most remarkably, they carved joints into them, like a carpenter would make in wood. On the top of each upright, they left a small, protruding knob, a tenon. And on the underside of the lintel stones that would sit on top, they carved out a corresponding hole, a mortise. This mortise and tenon system would lock the stones together, making the structure incredibly stable. For the great outer circle, they even curved the lintels slightly, so that when placed end to end, they would form a smooth and perfect circle. They also used tongue-and-groove joints to link the lintels to each other. This was not primitive building. This was masonry of the highest order, conceived and executed without metal tools, without written language, without the wheel. Once a stone was shaped, it had to be moved. The 20-mile journey from the Marlborough Downs to the Salisbury Plain was an epic undertaking. A single stone weighing 40 tons would be carefully levered onto a massive wooden sledge. The path would have to be cleared. They may have laid down a track of wooden rollers in front of the sledge. And then, the people would pull. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of men and women, their bodies leaning into the thick, plaited ropes. The ropes creak and strain. The sledge groans. The great stone moves, perhaps only inches at a time. A leader would chant a rhythm, a deep, guttural song that everyone would follow, pulling in perfect, unified time. It would have been a slow, crawling procession across the landscape. They would have had to navigate hills and valleys, soft ground and streams. The effort would have been immense, the focus absolute. It was more than labor. It was a ritual, a sacred act of bringing a sleeping giant to its new home. As each sarsen stone arrived at the monument, the site would have been a hive of activity. The smaller, precious bluestones were carefully taken down and moved aside, to be reused later. The ground was prepared for the new giants. To raise a 30-ton upright, they would first dig a massive pit, with one side a gentle slope and the other a sheer, vertical wall. The bottom of the pit would be lined with wooden stakes to prevent the stone from shattering. Then, they would push and pull the great sarsen until its base slid down the ramp and into the hole. It would now be resting at a sharp angle. The next part was the most dangerous and awe-inspiring. Using a complex system of levers and sheer human strength, they would begin to haul the stone upright. They may have built great wooden A-frames to act as cranes. Slowly, painstakingly, they would pull on the ropes, the stone rising degree by degree, until with a final great heave and a deep, shuddering thud, it would settle into its vertical position. The crowd that had gathered to watch would have let out a great roar of triumph and relief. Then, they would immediately pack the pit with rubble and earth, tamping it down to hold the giant firmly in place, where it would stand for thousands of years. Even more challenging was raising the lintels. each weighing around 7 tons, to sit atop the uprights. The most likely method was that they built enormous ramps of earth, chalk, and timber, rising up alongside the uprights. They would then drag the lintel stone up the ramp, a slow and precarious ascent. Once it was level with the top of the uprights, they would have had to maneuver it with painstaking precision, using levers to nudge it sideways until the mortise holes on its underside dropped perfectly over the tenons on the uprights, locking them into place with a granite-like finality. They did this 30 times for the outer circle, and they did it 5 times for the even larger inner horseshoe of trilithons. The central trilithon, the Great Trilithon, was the largest of all, its uprights towering over 20 feet above the ground. It was a masterpiece of engineering, coordination, and unwavering faith. When it was complete, the monument was utterly transformed. It was no longer a simple circle, but a complex, multi-layered temple of stone. From a distance, the Great Sarsen Circle would have appeared as a solid, impenetrable wall of gray stone, a fortress of faith. But as you drew closer, you would see the gaps between the pillars, and as you passed through them, you would enter a world of giants. The sheer scale of the stones would have been overwhelming, dwarfing any person who stood among them. The sky would be framed by the great trilithons, turning the heavens themselves into a part of the architecture. And it was all aligned. The entire structure was oriented with breathtaking precision. The main axis, leading from the entranceway through the center of the Sarsen horseshoe, pointed directly to the rising sun on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. And in the opposite direction, it pointed to the setting sun on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. This was the temple's ultimate purpose. It was a celestial observatory, a calendar in stone, a sacred stage for the great drama of the sun's journey. The secrets it held were no longer just of the earth, but of the entire cosmos. It was a place where heaven and earth met, where humanity had carved its understanding of the universe into the very fabric of the world. The giants had come, and they stood in silent, patient watch, waiting for the sun. The great temple of Sarsen stone was now complete, but the work was not yet finished. The builders, with a reverence that is hard to comprehend, now turned their attention back to the smaller, sacred blue stones. These precious stones, which had made their own epic journey from the Welsh mountains, were not discarded. They were incorporated into the new, grand design, their magical, healing presence given a place of honor within the mighty fortress of the Sarsens. Carefully, they raised the blue stones once more. Some were placed in a circle between the outer Sarsen ring and the inner Trilithon horseshoe. Others were arranged in a smaller horseshoe shape within the great Sarsen horseshoe, mirroring its form. It was as if the Sarsens were the strong outer body, the protectors, and the blue stones were the inner, spiritual heart of the monument. The contrast would have been striking. The massive, pale gray, carefully shaped Sarsens and the smaller, dark, ruggedly natural blue stones. It was a union of 2 different landscapes, 2 different kinds of stone, 2 different forms of sacred power. And there was one more stone, a particularly special blue stone, that was given the most prominent position of all. It was a large, flat slab, a greenish sandstone from even further away in Wales, and they laid it down in the very center of the monument, in front of the great trilithon. We call it the altar stone. Perhaps that is what it was, a place for offerings, for sacred objects to be displayed, or for a high priest or priestess to stand during a ceremony. It lay at the absolute focal point of the entire structure, the place where all the celestial lines of sight converged. Now let us imagine what it was like to be there, 4,000 years ago, on the morning of the summer solstice. The night before would have been a time of vigil. People would have gathered from all over the island, making a pilgrimage to the great stone circle. The plain around the monument would be dotted with the flickering lights of small campfires. The air would be filled with a low hum of anticipation, of quiet prayers and chants. Inside the circle itself, the priests and elders would be preparing. As the night wore on, the sky would be a deep, velvety black, studded with a brilliant canopy of stars. The Milky Way would stretch across the heavens like a river of diamonds. The great stones, darker than the night sky, would stand in absolute silence, their immense forms just visible against the starlight. There would be a feeling of profound peace, of being in the very center of the universe. Then, in the deep dark before the dawn, a change would begin. A faint, almost imperceptible lightning would appear on the northeastern horizon. A pale, gray-blue line would separate the earth from the sky. The birds would begin to stir, their first hesitant notes breaking the silence. A cool morning breeze would rustle the grasses of the plain. The people gathered would turn their attention to the entrance of the monument. Outside the main circle stood another, solitary stone, a rough, unshaped sarsen known as the heel stone. It stood at the head of the ceremonial avenue that led to the circle. Everyone would be watching that stone. The priests within the circle would be looking out from the center, through the gap in the great trilithon. Through the main entranceway, their gaze fixed on the horizon just to the left of the heel stone. The gray light would slowly turn to a soft, pearly pink. The colors on the horizon would deepen, to orange, to a fiery red. The anticipation would be almost unbearable. The entire world would seem to be holding its breath. And then, it would happen. The first dazzling sliver of the sun would break the horizon, a brilliant, blinding point of light. But it would not appear just anywhere. It would appear at the precise spot that the entire monument was designed to frame. The first ray of light on the longest day of the year would shoot like a golden arrow down the ceremonial avenue, past the heel stone, through the main entrance of the sarsen circle, and into the heart of the temple. It would strike the altar stone, bathing it in golden light. It would illuminate the dark, mysterious blue stones and cast long, dramatic shadows from the towering trilithons. For a few sacred moments, the temple would be filled with the pure, undiluted light of the newborn summer sun. In that moment, the stone circle would come alive. It was no longer just a collection of rocks, but a perfectly tuned instrument, playing a silent, celestial music. It was a confirmation that the seasons were turning as they should, that the cosmos was in order, that the powers of light and life were triumphant. A great cheer would rise from the crowd, a sound of pure joy and reverence. The shortest night was over. The long days of summer had begun. The winter solstice would have been a ceremony of a different kind, more solemn, more hopeful. On the shortest day of the year, as the world lay in the grip of cold and darkness, the people would gather again. This time, their attention would be turned to the southwest. They would watch as the pale winter sun made its low, brief journey across the sky. As the afternoon wore on, they would look from the center of the circle, through the uprights of the great trilithon. And there, perfectly framed between the two colossal pillars, the sun would set. It would sink below the horizon, a fiery ball of orange and red, its last rays lighting up the stones one final time before the longest night of the year began. This was not an ending, but a promise. The sun had reached its southernmost point, its lowest ebb, but the stones promised that it would return. From this day forward, the days would slowly begin to lengthen again. The light would come back. The ceremony was an act of faith, a plea to the sun not to abandon the world, and a celebration of the turning point, the moment of stillness before the slow rebirth of the year. For centuries, perhaps for 1,000 years, Stonehenge was a living, breathing temple. It was the religious center of southern Britain. People came to it not just for the solstices, but for all manner of reasons. They came to honor the ancestors who were buried there, whose spirits were believed to inhabit the very ground. They brought their sick and injured, believing that the healing power of the bluestones could make them well. The number of skeletons found in burials around the site showing signs of illness or injury suggests it was a place of pilgrimage, a prehistoric lords. They held feasts here, the remnants of which we can still find in the soil, the bones of thousands of pigs consumed in great ceremonial gatherings. They made offerings, perhaps pouring milk or ale onto the altar stone, or leaving precious objects, beautifully crafted stone axes or intricate bone pins, as gifts to the gods or the spirits of the place. It was a place that marked the cycles of life, birth, adulthood, death. It was a place that marked the cycles of the year, planting, growing, harvesting. And it was a place that marked the great, slow cycles of the cosmos, the patient procession of the sun, the moon, and the stars. It was a testament to a people who saw themselves not as separate from the universe, but as an intimate part of its intricate and beautiful design. They built what they knew, and what they knew was the timeless sacred rhythm of the world. The great circle of stones did not stand unchanging forever. The world around it was in constant flux. The people who had built it, the people of the new Stone Age, were slowly giving way to a new culture, a new technology. The Age of Bronze had arrived. These new people, often called the Beaker people because of the distinctive pottery beakers they placed in their graves, were skilled metalworkers. They knew the magic of smelting tin and copper to create a new, shining, powerful material, bronze. They were warriors and traders, with connections that stretched across Europe. They too revered the great stone circle on the plain. They did not tear it down. Instead, they adopted it and added to it. They saw the power in this ancient place, and sought to associate themselves with it. They began to bury their own important dead in the landscape around Stonehenge, but not in the same way as the first builders. They built great round barrows, large mounds of earth covering a central grave. The Salisbury Plain is dotted with hundreds of these barrows, like small, sleeping hills. They are often clustered together in cemeteries, and many are positioned on ridges or in locations where they have a clear and dramatic view of Stonehenge itself. It was as if their chieftains and heroes wanted to be laid to rest for eternity with their eyes fixed upon the great temple. Inside these barrows they placed their dead with great ceremony, often accompanied by rich grave goods. They left the distinctive clay beakers, perhaps once filled with a drink for the journey to the afterlife. They left daggers of shining bronze, some with intricately decorated hilts. They left beautiful necklaces of amber, jet, and gold, materials that had been traded from far-flung corners of the world, the amber from the Baltic coast, the gold perhaps from Ireland. One of the most remarkable finds from this era was a man we now call the Amesbury Archer. He was buried a few miles from Stonehenge, and his grave was filled with an astonishing array of objects: 100 flint arrowheads, 2 bronze daggers, a cushion stone used for metalworking, and 5 of the distinctive beaker pots. Analysis of his teeth showed that he had grown up far away, in the foothills of the Alps in modern-day Switzerland or Germany. He was a powerful and important man, a skilled craftsman and archer, who had made an immense journey to this sacred place, perhaps bringing the new secrets of metalworking with him. He chose to live and die near the great circle of stones. During this Bronze Age period, the final touches were put on the monument itself. The builders, or perhaps their descendants, carved mysterious symbols onto some of the sarsen stones. On one of the great uprights, they carefully pecked out the shapes of dozens of axe heads, the kind used at the time. On another, they carved the shape of a dagger. Were these the marks of powerful chieftains, their symbols of power forever etched onto the sacred stones? Or were they offerings, a way of giving the spirit of a valuable weapon to the gods of the temple? We may never know, but they are a ghostly reminder of the people who worshipped here when bronze was a new and precious thing. They also dug 2 more concentric rings of pits around the stones, known as the Y and Z holes. It seems they intended to rearrange the blue stones yet again, perhaps into a more perfect circular pattern. But for some reason, the work was never completed. The pits were left empty. The grand design was abandoned. It was perhaps the first sign that the central importance of Stonehenge was beginning to fade. Why did it happen? There is no single, simple answer. The world was changing. New beliefs may have been arriving from the continent. The focus of power may have shifted to other parts of the island, to great hill forts that were beginning to be built. Perhaps the climate changed, making the high, exposed plain a less hospitable place. Or perhaps, after 2,000 years of continuous use and rebuilding, the great temple had simply served its purpose. Its rituals became memories. Its meanings faded like mist in the morning sun. The people stopped coming. The great feasts ceased. The solstice ceremonies were no longer performed. The wind and the rain began their slow, patient work of reclaiming the monument. One of the great trilithons fell, perhaps during a harsh winter frost or a tremor in the earth. The sound of its collapse, the mighty groan of the stones and the thunderous crash as the lintel hit the ground, must have echoed across a silent and empty plain. Weeds grew in the spaces between the stones. Lichen, in beautiful patterns of gray, green, and orange, began to colonize the surfaces of the sarsens, a slow, living paint applied by the centuries. The ditch and bank, once so stark and white, became softened and grassed over, their sharp lines blurring back into the gentle curves of the landscape. The great temple of Stonehenge began its long sleep. It was no longer a center of power, but it was never entirely forgotten. It became a place of legend, a landmark of silent, brooding mystery. The centuries rolled on, one after another, like the slow waves of the grassy sea around the stones. The Iron Age came, and people built huge, fortified settlements on the hills overlooking the plain, but they seemed to pay little heed to the old stone circle. They had their own gods, their own rituals, their own sacred places. Then the Romans arrived, with their straight roads, their legions, and their stone-built towns. They certainly knew of Stonehenge. They built a road not far from it, and we find their coins and pottery scattered around the site. They were fascinated by it, as we are today, but they did not seem to know its original purpose. To them, it was already an ancient ruin, a relic of a mysterious, pre-literate people. They may have associated it with the Druids, the priestly class of the Celtic people they had conquered. But the truth is, Stonehenge was already ancient when the first Druids were born. It was as distant in time to them as the Roman Empire is to us. After the Romans left, new peoples came to the island: the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. They built their wooden halls and farmed the lowlands. The great stone circle remained on its wind-swept hill, a strange and lonely place. Its name was lost. Its purpose was forgotten. It entered the realm of myth. People began to tell stories to explain the impossible structure. How could mere mortals have raised such colossal stones? It must have been the work of giants. Or perhaps it was magic. A great story began to take shape, a story that linked the stones to the most famous wizard in all of British legend, Merlin. The story, written down by a chronicler named Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, told of a great battle where many noble British lords were treacherously slain. The king, Aurelius Ambrosius, wished to build a fitting memorial to them. He consulted the wizard Merlin, who told him of a magical stone circle in Ireland called the Giants' Dance. These stones, Merlin said, had been brought from Africa by giants and had powerful healing properties. Merlin led an expedition to Ireland to fetch the stones. The Irish army laughed at the British trying to move them, for no amount of force could stir them. But Merlin used his magic arts. He whispered spells, and the stones became light as feathers. They were loaded onto ships and brought to the Salisbury Plain, where Merlin re-erected them in the exact formation they had been in before. The story even explains the name, Stonehenge, a place of hanging stones. It is a wonderful story, and for hundreds of years people believed it to be the truth. It is a folk memory, perhaps, a distant, distorted echo of the real story. For the stones did indeed come from a great distance, and the blue stones were thought to have healing powers. The journey from the Preseli Hills was not made with magic, but with something just as powerful, the enduring strength of human cooperation and belief. Through the Middle Ages, the stones stood, a landmark for shepherds and travelers. They became part of the local landscape, as natural and as permanent as the hills themselves. The wind howled through the gaps on winter nights, and larks nested at their bases in the spring. They watched the building of the great cathedral in nearby Salisbury, its slender spire reaching for the sky, another testament to faith, built a mere 3,000 years after the last stone was raised at the henge. Then came a new age, an age of curiosity and science, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. People were no longer content with myths and legends. They wanted to measure, to understand, to know. Scholars and antiquarians began to visit Stonehenge. They drew detailed plans, they measured the stones, they speculated on how it could have been built. One of the first was the architect Inigo Jones in the early 17th century. He concluded, based on its elegant proportions, that it must have been built by the Romans. A little later, the antiquarian John Aubrey, the same man for whom the Aubrey holes are named, correctly identified it as a pre-Roman, pagan temple. He was the first to connect it with the Druids, a romantic association that has stuck in the popular imagination ever since. Another, William Stukeley, in the 18th century, did the first accurate surveying of the site. It was he who first truly recognized its astronomical significance, its precise alignment with the solstices. He saw that it was not just a temple, but a celestial clock. And so Stonehenge began to awaken from its long sleep. It was no longer just a place of myth, but an object of scientific inquiry, an archaeological puzzle of the highest order. The 19th and 20th centuries brought the first systematic excavations. Archaeologists began to dig carefully into the soil around the stones, uncovering the secrets that had been buried for millennia. They found the antler picks and the ox-bone shovels, the humble tools that had built this magnificent place. They found the post holes from the very first wooden structures. They found the cremated remains of the ancestral dead. They found the chippings of bluestone and sarsen, the debris from the original stone shapers. Each discovery was a new word in a long-lost language, allowing us to piece together the story of how and why Stonehenge was built. Geologists traced the bluestones back to their precise origins in the Preseli Hills, confirming the incredible story of their journey. Archaeologists experimented with moving and raising great stones using prehistoric technology, proving that it was, with enough people and enough ingenuity, entirely possible. Today, the stones still stand, silent and majestic on the Salisbury Plain. They have been battered by 4,500 winters. Some have fallen, others lean like tired old men. But their power remains undiminished. They are visited now by millions of people a year, from every corner of the modern world. We come as tourists, as pilgrims, as seekers of mystery. We look at them and we wonder. We wonder at the sheer determination of the people who built them. We wonder at their deep understanding of the sun and the moon, their connection to the cycles of the cosmos. We wonder what they believed, what they sang, what stories they told as they labored together under the vast and empty sky. The stones don't give up their secrets easily. They ask more questions than they answer. Was it a temple to the sun, a lunar observatory, a place of the ancestors, a center for healing, a symbol of unity and peace between warring tribes? Perhaps the truth is that it was all of these things, and more. It was a place that evolved over 500 years, its meaning and purpose changing with each new generation that added to it, that worshipped within it. It is not a single monument, but a story with many chapters, written in earth, wood, and stone. And now, it is time for our story to end, and for you to drift into your own long and peaceful sleep. As you close your eyes, imagine yourself standing on the quiet plain, long after the crowds have gone home. The moon, a silver sickle in the sky, casts a pale, ethereal light on the great stones. The air is still and cool. A barn owl glides silently between the trilithons, a fleeting gray shadow. The stones are not just old rocks. They are sleeping giants, filled with the memories of all the sunrises they have ever witnessed, all the ceremonies they have ever presided over, all the people who have ever stood in their shadow and looked up in awe. They stand as a bridge in time, connecting our busy, noisy world with a deep, quiet past. They remind us that we are part of a much longer story. They remind us of the enduring human need to find our place in the universe, to reach for the heavens, and to create something beautiful and permanent that will outlast us. Listen, can you hear it? It is not a sound for the ears, but for the heart. It is the whisper of the wind across the ancient grass. It is the echo of a prehistoric chant. It is the slow, steady, patient breathing of the stones themselves. They are at peace. They have stood for millennia, and they will stand for millennia more. Let their deep, silent stillness enter your own mind. Let the vastness of the plain and the immensity of the night sky cradle you. There are no more questions to ask, no more puzzles to solve. There is only the quiet majesty of this sacred place, and the promise of a deep and restful sleep. The secrets of Stonehenge are safe now, dreaming under the stars. And so are you. Good night.